Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, the South Carolina Gamecocks kicking off fall camp August 1st. Want to dive into, a few storylines that I'll be keeping my eye on for this South Carolina program. And you take a look at this team heading into fall camp. It's one of the more exciting programs where not only did you add a ton of talent through the transfer portal, I think more importantly, you have a ton of young talent that, just seems is ready to break out in the 2024 year. And over the next 3 to 4 weeks during fall camp, that's when we learn who are going to be the guys that, kind of emerge for this South Carolina program in the 2024 season. We're going to look at a few different position battles, but I think also talk about some breakout players who, we think kind of emerge as guys for this South Carolina program heading into 2024. Fired up to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, just want to say, thank you to you guys, to the South Carolina fans, whether we're doing our bold predictions, top 10 players, you guys continue to show not only a ton of love and support, but a ton of good comments in the comment section. I've been learning a ton from you guys as well. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. But more importantly, I would love to hear from you guys in the comment section, whether it's your biggest storylines or predicting some breakout players. Let it fly in the comment section. And without further ado, let's get into this one. I want to start with a few different position battles that I'm going to be taking a look at. And I think we got to start with the offensive line where, I think a lot of people just assume this South Carolina team is not very good because of the performance we saw in 2023. The more I go back to that South Carolina program in 2023, the more I say there were a lot of really positive aspects about this program. That being said, the one bugaboo in 2023 was the offensive line. And South Carolina fans, you guys know more than anybody, it is really hard to win football games consistently in the SEC with a below average offensive line. How much better does this offensive line get is probably the biggest question mark we have for this South Carolina program. Now, I think what's exciting about this offensive line going into the 2024 season, you have a much more competitive room from a depth standpoint. I felt like last year South Carolina was forced to play some true freshmen early because they just didn't have enough depth in the offensive line room. Obviously, they had a few injuries going into the season, which was kind of forcing some of these young players to probably just play a little bit more early than Shane Beamer and this coaching staff wanted. I think those players playing early, guys like Tree and guys like Trevon Baugh, I think they're going to be better for it in 2024. I mean, there's not a lot of freshmen that get the opportunity to get the amount of reps and snaps that these guys got in 2023. So that's going to make them better players in 2024. But I think more importantly, you look at the South Carolina offensive line and say, you got some really intriguing young talent, guys like Trevon Baugh and Tree and Marquis Anderson. But you also went to the transfer portal and kind of filled it up with a lot of veteran talent as well. So you kind of have that high floor in terms of, hey, there's some guys that we know what they are. They can play solid football for the South Carolina program. But you kind of make no mistake about it. This South Carolina offensive line also has, kind of a really high ceiling because we look at guys like Trevon Baugh and Tree and say, those guys have the capability of being all SEC caliber offensive linemen. So the number one storyline I'm looking at is, kind of the offensive line rotation. How does the best five get on the football field? I'm also looking at some young cats as well. Now, I think true freshman Josiah Thompson, who we're going to talk about in terms of breakout players, I was a huge fan of this kid coming out of high school. He's a phenomenal athlete. He's extremely long. He's going to be a very good offensive lineman for South Carolina. I think the question is heading into fall camp, can it be as a true freshman? Because I think the one thing you wanted to see from Josiah Thompson, probably put on a little bit more weight, add a little bit more physicality to his game. If he was able to do that during summer workouts, I think Josiah Thompson could emerge as a starting caliber tackle, and then maybe you can kick Tree onto the inside. He's probably going to be a better guard than he is tackle. I think that's kind of what I have my eyes on for the South Carolina offensive line. The next position group I'm looking at is the wide receiver room. I think a lot of people on paper see Xavier Legette go to the NFL and say it's going to be a problem for South Carolina. Shane Beamer went to the transfer portal and got a lot of proven talent, right? Jared Brown coming from Coastal, Gage coming from Miami of Ohio. And then I think you're looking at some young talent, guys like Nick Harbor, in terms of, hey, is it finally their year to kind of break out and be those true difference makers in that wide receiver room. Going back to 2023, the problem with this South Carolina pass catcher room is it was kind of a one-trick pony show, right? If the ball wasn't going to Xavier Legette, they just didn't have that many playmakers that could go make plays for this South Carolina offense, which for opposing defenses, it got awfully easy to kind of scheme up against South Carolina. Hey, if we take Xavier Legette away, which teams did not do a very good job of, but if they were able to, there just wasn't that many other pass catchers in that room that could really hurt South Carolina. So I think on paper, it's hard to argue that they get better losing a guy like Xavier Legette, but I think this unit might be a little bit better because you actually have multiple different guys that can be difference makers in the pass catcher room. And if that's the case, I expect this South Carolina pass catcher room to get better heading into the 2024 season. You go to the defensive side of the football, a couple of different position groups that I'm looking at in terms of, position battles, but I think more importantly, rotation. Let's start on the defensive line. I think this South Carolina defensive line not enough people are talking about. I look at this group and say, it could be one of the better units that we see in the SEC, specifically on the inside. Alex Huntley, Tonka, TJ Sanders. That is a very good three-man rotation. You add a guy like DeAndre Drills from Pitt, we feel really good about. I mean, they are deep and they are talented on the inside of the defensive line. I think there's a possibility that, 3 or 4 of those guys go to the NFL after this year. So you're talking about 4 NFL caliber guys on the inside of the South Carolina defensive line. We feel, pretty dang good about that. Then you look on the edge and say, all right, Gilbert Edmond, Kyle Kennard, 2 guys coming in through the portal. Obviously, Gilbert Edmond previously has been with South Carolina. If you get Gilbert Edmond that we saw in 2022, he's going to be a very quality edge rusher for South Carolina. You kind of know that Kyle Kennard is going to be that guy. There's 3 guys that I'm looking at in terms of the South Carolina edge room that I really think could break out. 1, Brian Thomas Jr., 2, Desmond Yu, and I think number 3, Dylan Stewart. I mean, Dylan Stewart won one of my favorite prospects in the 2024 cycle, But I think more importantly, was a guy that we saw during the spring game and absolutely dominate. It's really hard to find true freshmen that can come in on the line of scrimmage and kind of play at a high level in the SEC. Dylan Stewart looked to be that guy. And so I started looking at this South Carolina team and saying, 1, I think he has some NFL talent on the defensive line, but I think more importantly, this South Carolina defensive line is deep. And that has been a problem for South Carolina over the last couple of years. You're finally seeing the Shane Beamer recruiting classes, kind of pay off in terms of depth in the 2 and 3 deep. That was, kind of been South Carolina's biggest problem over the last couple of years. Now, going into our breakout players, I want to go back to the offensive side of the football and just talk about guys that, if they put it together in fall camp, I think significantly elevate what South Carolina's ceiling could be. You obviously got to start with Nick Harbor. This is, from a physical trait standpoint, one of the most talented, freakish players that we see in all of college football. Now, we kind of knew Nick Harbor wasn't going to be a year 1 guy. There was even question marks about what position he was going to play, whether it was going to be wide receiver, tight end. There was even some buzz around Nick Harbor potentially being an edge rusher when he was coming out of high school. And so we kind of knew that he'd need to pick a position, kind of become a better football player. We know he's a great athlete. And you kind of knew year 1 wasn't going to be his year. He settled into that wide receiver room. We know he has the physical talent. Could he emerge and become that wide receiver 1 for South Carolina? That's obviously the biggest question in that pass catcher room. You look at the quarterback. I mean, we've made it through all the way this word 9 minutes in to South Carolina's fall camp discussion. We haven't talked about Lenore Sellers. I think a fascinating quarterback prospect that outside of South Carolina fans, not getting talked about enough. This kid is extremely talented. He can get it done in the run game. He's got a really big arm. South Carolina in that 2023 class kind of took a flyer on Lenore Sellers. He was a raw quarterback prospect that wasn't necessarily the best quarterback, but had a lot of physical traits that you liked. Everything that you read within the South Carolina program, Lenore Sellers is putting it together. This is a high upside quarterback, and what I think we're all looking for in fall camp is the consistency. We know Lenore Sellers can be the highs for Lenore Sellers are going to be awfully dang high. Can he be consistent week in, week out, day in, day out during fall camp? That's what you kind of look for those young quarterbacks that are pecking for a starting spot. And Lenore Sell is obviously quarterback one heading into 2024. Now, the last guy I'll shout out on the offensive side of the football, again, Josiah Thompson. I just want to see the body type. I want to see the physicality. Again, I think this is a guy that could play early for South Carolina, but at the very least, just provide very quality depth for the South Carolina offensive line, which again was a massive problem last year. You go to the defensive side of the football, a couple of guys that I'll be looking at. One, Demetrius Knight Jr. I think that was a sneaky get from the transfer portal. Now, South Carolina has some really good linebackers coming back. I look at that linebacker room and say, it's a bunch of guys that are graduates, redshirt seniors, have played a ton of football. It's hard to see that South Carolina linebacker room not being a pretty dang solid unit. And you pair up a good linebacker room behind what we think is going to be a good defensive line. That's kind of the recipe to have a dominant defense. Obviously, Dylan Stewart is the guy that I think we're all looking at in terms of, South Carolina last year had a lot of their pass rush production come from the inside of the defensive line. They kind of needed that elite edge rusher to step up, and you just didn't have that in the 2023 season. I think Dylan Stewart has the ability to be that kind of guy for South Carolina in the 2024 year. So I'll be looking at true freshman Dylan Stewart, Demetrius Knight Jr., who I think is an extremely talented linebacker. Those are the guys I'm looking at. It's going to be a really fun team to kind of follow throughout fall camp. Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section on some of your storylines and breakout players. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.